It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's Wellness Book Talk. Palo Alto University is dedicated to addressing pressing and emerging issues in the fields of psychology and counseling that meet the needs of today's diverse society. And today I am so pleased to be speaking with author Dr. Kristine Klussman about her latest book, Connection: How to Find the Life You're Looking For in the Life You Have. Let me first introduce Dr. Klussman and then we'll have our conversation. Dr. Klussman completed her PhD at Palo Alto University. We're very proud of her as one of our alums, and did additional doctoral training at Harvard Medical School's Department of Behavioral Medicine. In addition to being an author, Dr. Kristine Klussman is a health psychologist, a clinical supervisor, researcher, and has found time to teach our students, which we're very, very excited about as well. She's the founder and principal of the nonprofit think tank Connection Lab, which you'll hear a little bit about today. It's a psychology research center exploring tools to help people live more meaningful, values-driven, authentic, dare I say, connected lives. And as an invited keynote speaker and TEDx speaker, I know you've worked with young people with TEDx as well, which is exciting. She shares her approach to well-being at conferences and workshops around the country. And in addition to all of that, maintains a private practice that offers individual connection coaching. So a very busy person has taken the time out of her day to join us. So we're very delighted about that. Before we get started, a quick housekeeping item. Please use the Q&A, the question and answer feature to submit questions. And we will try to address those as we go along or at the end of the session. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Klussman. Delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you.
I'm excited to talk with you about your book, which I really, really enjoyed, called Connection: How to Find the Life You're Looking For in the Life You Have. We could all use some help right now after this most challenging of years. Let's start, if you wouldn't mind, with an excerpt from your book that describes the patients you worked with in San Francisco who really inspired you to think more deeply about this concept of connection. Would you be so kind as to share that with us?
First, let me just say, Maureen, what a special honor it is to be talking with you today. I have just such tremendous affection for you and Palo Alto University and the training that I received. So I'm so happy to be here. And yes, I would be happy to read that. So when I told people what I was doing for a living, they typically assumed that my job was depressing and difficult, but it was actually the opposite. These medically ill and dying patients were some of the most inspiring, awake individuals I'd ever met. They had achieved self-awareness and found contentment amidst some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Working with these terminally ill men and women, I truly began the most important phase of my training. I was honored and inspired to be among the awake, and I learned much from their example. This experience was my first glimpse of what I would later understand as true, authentic connection. In a surprising large subset of people I worked with, patients were crystal clear about their viewpoints, their priorities, and the things that truly matter to them. They cared about spending time with family and close friends and being emotionally available and open. They felt strongly about healing rifts, speaking truths, and being present. They prioritized slowing down, simplifying their activities, and showing gratitude towards others. More than anything, they cared about meaning, and they reflected upon meaningful people and events in their lives and what unfinished business they still had. I seldom witnessed these patients reciting details of their work identity, their accomplishments, or their belongings or acquisitions. They typically didn't want to expend energy on disagreements, disappointments, or resentments. They were adamant about connecting with loved ones, expressing their feelings or opinions, and living their remaining days in alignment with what mattered most.
I mean, that just must have been such a powerful and as you sort of alluded to at the beginning of that excerpt, somewhat counterintuitive opportunity in the sense that you were working with people in various, very serious stages of illness and things. So say a bit more, if you could, about how working with those patients, observing these amazing characteristics, and how that inspired you to explore the concept of self-connection, and ultimately, of course, led to the book. But sort of what are some of the steps along the way to that, in that direction?
No, definitely. Thanks. When I reflect back, I guess the thing that was different about our program, the health psychology program that I created, we wanted to see everybody, to destigmatize getting mental health support. So it was kind of the first opportunity I had had in my life to just work with people who were doing well and people who were not doing well, and versus just the people who get identified and sent to us because they're having problems coping. And I started to really see a clear difference between my clients, the ones who were doing well, coping better than the ones who were not. Their differences were explained. I started to notice beyond the different diagnosis or their different demographics, what really separated these groups were the people who tended to seem like they had a wake-up call, and that they really had come into a clarity about how they wanted to spend the remaining time that they had. So, that was the first thing that inspired me and got me really interested in these people who were living in some ways what felt better than, myself or other well people I know. I just felt like they had something special to offer and to teach. And later, down the road, as I got to know them and really think about, what they were experiencing, I came to realize that, each of us at some point in our life, regardless of if it comes in the form of a medical illness or, some other loss or just life, is that we're going to have to face and be confronted with the very important question of whether the life that we're living is the life that we wanted. And I decided that, I really just wanted to help people answer that question, and hopefully sooner rather than later, without having to have a crisis prompted. So I think
I love that you're essentially, and I know you were inspired with some thinking around positive psychology and sort of health, but I love the fact that you're thinking about, I am this well-trained clinical psychologist whose whole, essence is to help people through issues, and you're observing that I could actually help people get to where they need to be before they face a crisis, right? I think that's just such an important, to so many of us. I think we wait, right? We wait till something like that happens in our lives, and then we say, oh, what was I doing? So I love that you sort of took that on as a task. And I think one of the things I wanted to mention and talk about today is that, to me, one of the things that sets your book apart from some of these sort of psych books that you see that are written for the public in particular, is that some of your findings are based on research from your own research lab. So part of your journey that I'm very interested in is your decision to set up the Connection Lab, sort of how you moved in that direction. So tell us a little bit about that process, about the lab, and some of the work you decided needed to be done on the research side to really get you where you wanted to go.
Oh yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Honestly, that makes me think of my training at Palo Alto University, because so many of us came in, I think, like talking the talk, like saying we were interested in research to get our PhD, but under our breath thinking like, I'm never gonna, I'm really just gonna do clinical work. But I came to love it, as I think so, and revere it, and really understand the importance of the blend of clinical work and research. So it just never felt right to stray too far away from it. And that when these important questions were coming up and clinical observations, it's only half the equation, without measuring it and validating your hypotheses. So it was just a natural extension of how I was trained. but yeah, a little bit about the lab. So we conduct qualitative and quantitative studies, and we're a small group out of San Francisco, and we study, subjects like self-connection, meaning, and mindfulness, quite a bit of mindfulness because it's so related to what we're studying. And, just to nutshell kind of our findings and what we're doing, like in general, we've found that, knowing who you are, and accepting both the good and the bad of that, and acting in alignment with that is generally good for you. So that's kind of our, what we focus on. And a big effort for our lab has been contributing this new concept of self-connection to the literature, and then also creating like a validated measure. So, that we have spent a lot of time just, working on that. And in the process, we've also found that, some of our initial studies have really shown us that self-connection relates to a lot of positive well-being measures, like improved affect, meaning in life, both life and job satisfaction and flourishing. And a recent study has even suggesting that self-connection might relate more strongly to well-being than physical activity, which is one of the most robust relationships that we know in the literature. So we need to replicate that study, but we're pretty excited about that. And I think basically, when we were just talking about this the other day, where we are in our lab and where we need to go, but I think we've done a decent job of identifying the what and the why, particularly around self-connection. And now we're kind of turning our attention to the how. How do we manipulate it and help people gain more of it? So that's what we're up to.
I just want to come work in your lab. So that's that's where this is going. Actually, someone in the audience has a question that I was going to ask you as well. So what age groups are involved in your research in the lab? Are you continuing to work with people near the end of lives, or are you, and who are your participants in that work?
Oh yeah, like our populations. We're pretty broad based. So we're mostly adults. We haven't done any children or teens yet. And, anything from students to professionals, to just the whole, anybody that qualifies as an adult. So it's a range, and sometimes we will focus it on, by what people are up to in their professional life. In the physical activity study, we did, people who are different types of exercisers. So it varies from study to study who our population is.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, it just sounds, I think when we talk about evidence-based practice, right, and obviously we're very committed to making sure our students are well prepared and well trained. I think what you're really describing is evidence-based thinking, right? Is questions are coming up in your clinical work, and some of those questions can be answered, in the clinical setting, but some of them are generating these other questions, and you're finding a way to investigate those. So I think it's a really exciting model, and I would love to hear about more people doing this kind of work. But let's get to the meat of this. So you've mentioned now your concept of self-connection, and the importance of that in this sort of understanding your theory, really. So you describe it as having three components. So, it's a pretty interesting construct. Can you say a bit more about the concept and kind of how you're thinking about self-connection?
Sure, absolutely. So in the book, I like to translate it to lay terms, and I use a lot of different ways of trying to help people understand what we mean by self-connection. But in the research, it's pretty boiled down to what we call the 3 A's. And, it involves awareness, acceptance, and alignment. It was just a coincidence that they all tended to be A's. But the awareness piece is having an awareness of your true self, your wants, your needs, your deepest held beliefs. And then the acceptance is having an acceptance of that, both the good and the bad, not just what you should or what society wants or your family, but who you really are, and and not resisting that. And then the final piece is maybe the most important piece. It's the alignment. It's making it your practice to aspire to live in integrity with your values. And notice, like I said, in aspire, we're not looking for perfection at all. Disconnection is a constant thing to be battled and, overcome, but it's really about keeping it as a strong intention, a priority, and never letting it stray too far from your awareness, in order to feel like your life was on track.
I mean, I think that sounds, especially in our world, where we don't take the time for those sorts of things. I think those sound easier to say than they are to do, each of the steps. But I think there's a fourth A I heard, which is aspire. I think sometimes what I worry about is that we worry about the perfect rather than the journey, so I think that's really an important. I'm going to add that as your fourth A.
I love that. And one other thing I would add too is that we're finding it doesn't take major efforts in any categories. What's happening is that we're getting cut off from big areas in our life, like cut off from our bodies, or causes we care about, or our communities, and it kind of leaves this building of loss and unsettled just angst. And we're finding that some of the most minute efforts in each of those categories can do the job of reconnecting us to what we care about. And I really mean like symbolic, tiny gestures. When you don't have the bandwidth for something more than that, is important just to bring it back into awareness and say, I haven't forgotten about you. I still care about you. So that's really what we're after, and is the, tiny steps. I love that book about tiny goals and that research. So
that's great. And back to a follow-up question came in about the people that you work with in the lab, whether you are working with people who are managing long-term chronic pain, which I'm sure is something that you've seen in the work with your patients, but I don't know if that's something you've focused on in your work.
Not now. I mean, I used to work in the pain clinic at one of the training hospitals I worked at, and I certainly have worked with those folks. And I think this, especially the mindfulness, component of this work applies. It's the universality of some of these concepts that I love. I'm really attracted to ideas like meaning making that are just speak to our common humanity and get away from this is good for these people and this is good for these people. So
yeah, I think that's I mean, I think that, well, we can talk at different points about the focus of positive psychology and sort of thinking that way, but I think if you take a health-centered perspective, which is what you're really doing, it does change the frame, right, for how to be thinking about this. Well, let me ask you, so we've obviously come off an incredibly difficult, time in our world, for multiple reasons, pandemic, racism, just a huge variety of challenges this year. And there have been many stories about Zoom fatigue. Here we are on Zoom, but high levels of stress and anxiety. I think the APA's, latest data show 84% of people are reporting, increased levels of anxiety, and certainly burnout. We're hearing a lot about that concept right now in the workplace setting. So can you talk about the connection between sort of self-connection and what you were just describing in the four A's, as we're now talking about it, and burnout? Like, are they inverse relationships? Can we help ourselves through some of these challenges, specifically through this work?
No, I'm really glad you asked this question about burnout, because we actually just did a study on this. And yeah, let me see if I can get to all the components of the question. But I think the first thing that you said that really hit me was this year that we've been through, and that, you know, how where that's left us. And we've thought a lot about this in our lab too. And what I'm seeing just from a lot of my clients is just that, you know, we're all kind of, a lot of people are disoriented. Like, we've spent this year living by a completely different set of priorities than the ones that we're used to. And more than anything, have been prevented from kind of goal setting. You know, we've been in this mode intentionally of wait and see, and there's really been some beauty and silver linings about that, but it's also suspended us, you know, our reality for a while. And I think now, as we're emerging from that, I know personally, you know, I feel some disorientation from that. And, you know, like, who am I? Where am I going? You know, and what I think needs to happen more than anything is, you know, and you'll hear me talk a lot about this related to self-connection, but is a re-examination of our values and our priorities. And that's a really active task. That, you know, a lot of people talk that talk, but they don't actually really spend some time writing and, you know, being with that and thinking it through. And like, I need to do that too. You know, I've, like, in my work life, for example, one of my priorities and values were really centered around a lot around autonomy and flexibility and freedom. And now, you know, I can already see that after this whole year of living differently, that's given us a lot of information. You know, we need to compare that with our old information and say, where do I stand now? Like, now for me, I have too much autonomy and freedom, and if any, in isolation. You know, I want the structure. So, you know, I think a re-examination is in order.
Well, yeah, and I love that idea.
Looked at as a welcome task, like an opportunity to, you know, really update this new version of yourself. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of that right now. And then the other topic of burnout. So there's this growing body of literature that's very exciting about burnout and stress mindset that says, basically, in a nutshell, if you view, it's all in how you view it. If you view, you know, your stress as debilitating, then you're going to have negative outcomes and it's going to lead to burnout. And if you view stress as helping you be more productive and motivating, then you're going to have much better outcomes. It's not going to lead to burnout. So that was there was a very famous Stanford study, you know, with college kids, kind of asking them to report what they did for the summer. And, you know, one of them, they said, just tell us the good things about the day. And the other group, they said, tell us how what you did in the day really related to your values. And they found
that was the intervention.
Different result. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that was the intervention, just that simple, like, do it this way or do it.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry, did I go blank for a while?
No, you were fine.
Okay, so we ended up kind of replicating this study, but including self-connection to see if there was a relationship. And we were thrilled to find that self-connection was a mediating variable, so that when you feel stress, people with higher levels of self-connection, it didn't matter what your mindset was, whether you had a mindset that, you know, the stress was more productive or whether it was debilitating, the self-connection was served as kind of a protective factor. So that was really exciting to us. And a big thing that I'm recommending right now for people, like a quick exercise that you can do if you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, is just take like 5 minutes at night and do a little bit of journaling about how what you did that day, the activities of your day, how it relates to your values, you know, and kind of work on that reframing. And it's found that leads to higher confidence, you know, improved affect, all kinds of good things. So it's a tiny little intervention that you can do on yourself as a protective factor.
That's great, and actually answers one of our audience members' questions, which is the types of interventions do you use in your studies? And this, I mean, this is a simple example in a way, not simple necessarily to do in a consistent basis, I've found in my own life, but an important example of something. It does not have to be huge change. Right. It can be a small change, and I think that's really, really important for people to understand that, your book really has a lot of opportunities for exercises and other kinds of activities that are not requiring major changes, but kind of incremental and small changes. And I think that's what makes it for me, that's what made it sort of accessible. As you know, I'm a very busy person, and I can't, like, the idea of doing some big change is very hard, but finding 5 minutes, kind of hard.
I can do that.
I can do that. So on the other side of self-connection, and you've mentioned this a little bit, but let's say a little bit more about it, is disconnection. Right. So how do we experience disconnection in our lives? And is this really one of the major concerns of our time in a way? Talk about that idea of disconnection.
Oh. Yeah, God, I could say a lot about it. I think that I do think it's one of the major epidemics of our time. And what I do know about it is that it's brutally painful, especially in its extreme form. And that we don't often notice it because it comes on in a very subtle, insidious way, kind of death by 1,000 self-betrayals. And you can still be very high functioning and be very disconnected from your life. And it can be, we might be disconnected in one area, like from our body, or it can be from others, or from our work, from our communities. There's so many, any area of life, but how it feels often, what I've heard, especially in our research, when we interview some of our participants and they tell us what it feels like, it's often described as kind of feeling either adrift or a little lost, or like you're just in this underlying dis-ease, like you're wasting time, or you're not making the most of this precious life, and like time is flying by too fast. So it, in its subtler forms, that's what it is. In its bigger forms, it's extremely, extremely painful, and looks like depression and anxiety and everything else.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you particularly in your clinical work, but also in your research. Are you, what is the overlap with some of those, I just thinking as you're talking about depression, obviously, and mild depression, serious depression, but anxiety generally, how much of those there might be some explanation coming from what you're describing?
I think so. I mean, I like to kind of look at the biggest picture possible, of human suffering, let's say, and even though we have these buckets of diagnosis, and what I see, as kind of the origin, not always, but of so much, I want to even say benign suffering, is, modern society. Like the modern society we live in kind of encourages disconnection in so many different ways. So, I think it's something that, no matter who you are, that you're still going to be swimming upstream against a tide that, is constantly lulling you to disconnect from what matters to you most. And that, then there's gradations that can be mild, and it can also go into extremes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking it's interesting when you're describing that, because the more that we are disconnected from each other, from the world, or the sort of fake connection of whatever social media does. It also does sort of seem as though it could set us up for more polarization, right? For really exacerbating those differences, which I think we're seeing in the world right now.
Absolutely. And we already know, it's really well established in the research, like how terribly bad it is for our health and our longevity and our emotions to be socially disconnected and have a lack of belonging, and how that's one of the most common things that people report suffering from. So one of the things that we're starting to look at in our lab is how that lack of social connection and belonging is underscored, or starts with a disconnection from the self. It's really hard to connect to other people well when you've lost that connection to yourself.
Well, and we have a wonderful question from someone in the audience, and I want to break it in here because I think it really helps to link back to your work with your seriously ill patients. So it's someone who really wants to come into the counseling field and work especially with cancer patients and their families. And what I'm hearing you say in this conversation is that I think you're trying, let me see if I'm understanding what your project is here. In some ways, you're trying to help people find the connection with their self and hopefully through that, their families and loved ones, et cetera, without having to come to that a crisis point, right? Where the crisis of, cancer or other long-term illness can sometimes be the point at which it causes people to think differently. You're sort of trying to back up that process in a way. Is that too simplistic?
No, I mean, that's fair. But I think it's really helping people walk through that door of awakening at any point in their life, whether before, during, or after, a cancer experience, whenever they, feel able and willing and ready, and kind of just raising the awareness around this as kind of a little bit of a sleeper issue. It's not something we talk about or think about because, some of the more obvious issues and diagnoses and mental health issues get our attention.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked about the idea that the primary care person should be the mental health professional, right? And everything else feed off of that. And this person who asked the question, Don also wanted to get your advice about how do you suggest people break into working with these populations of the type of people you worked with long-term illness or cancer? How do you have any suggestions for someone who wants to do that work, how they might get there?
Absolutely. I mean, I love doing hospital psychology work, and I just think work in a hospital, and they have, you're going to be so well trained for that when you come out of Palo Alto University. You're going to have good clinical skills, amazing assessment skills, and research. You're like perfectly poised for hospital work. And almost every hospital is going to have those departments in a cancer, and not all, but cancer centers. My favorite program, of course, is the one that I was involved with and had the opportunity to found, the postdoctoral health psychology training program at CPMC. So if anyone's interested in that, I can hook you up with the training director now. The current training director is Jeremy Bornstein.
Excellent. I'm sure we have had students with interest there, so that's great. So let me get us back to kind of since I mentioned that your book has so much helpful information about how to do this work with or without without a therapist. But one thing I love is you talk about you present a three-way strategy for moving toward reconnection. So we talked about self-connection, disconnection. How do we get to the reconnection? You talk about setting the attention, intention, focusing attention, and asking an important question. So can you say a little bit about your, this three-way strategy and how that might play out for people?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really starts with the intention and attention, and I love the saying that intention and attention are the wings of awareness. That's true, across, anything that you're trying to do. And I love to suggest to people that it's really about a way to begin to this work is to just be asking yourself, this is how I started, what am I feeling connected right now? And try to ask yourself that as many times as you can in a day. And what you're really kind of it's a mindfulness exercise. What you're looking for are moments of ease versus moments of unease. And you don't have to have a lot of knowledge or read the book or anything. This is more of kind of the affective way into this, feeling your way and using your intuition to say, how am I feeling right now? Do I feel connected? Do I feel present with who I am with? Or is my mind somewhere else? Am I enjoying this? Am I engaged? And then I like to ask this follow-up question. If not, is there anything I can do right now to feel more connected to what I'm doing or to make it more meaningful? And maybe that's removing something or adding something, or it's an internal shift or an external shift, leaving. So
Right.
anyway, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I use that as kind of a very basic starting point for getting people to become curious. And it's amazing what they can learn even in 24 hours of playing with that.
I mean, I think just having the simplicity of in some way, it's not a simple outcome, I don't think, but I think there's something that resonates with the simplicity of the approach that makes it feel accessible. I can ask that question. I was thinking, as you were saying it, I was thinking like, I'm so engaged, I forgot that we had an audience for that. You and I are just talking, right? That's a feeling of being engaged that I have to say there are other Zoom meetings that I've had where I don't have that feeling, and so what does that tell me, right? So what does that tell us about our
And to your point, Maureen, it feels really good. Like I'm feeling that too. It feels so. It's naturally very self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
To try to amplify, the level of connection that you're experiencing, which is what I love about it. But you're also turning people into little researchers. Like they're doing their own data gathering, which is like such a great way to approach non-judgmentally, just being curious about, when do I feel this way or not? And
well, and I think that's certainly, and I'm sure in the teaching that you're doing with the cognitive behavioral therapy and other approaches, that's a very important piece of it, right? Is that
yeah.
ability to do that work. So actually, I wanted to ask you about, as a researcher myself, I can't help but be very interested in how you've decided to address some of these concepts that are very difficult, from a measurement standpoint. I really appreciate the fact that you've worked on validating certain measures of things, because I think these are not easy concepts. So one of the concepts you talk about is the true self, and you've actually worked on specifically how to measure that, how to think about it from a measurement standpoint. I just love to hear sort of how you think about how you've approached that in the lab.
Okay. To be clear, I mean, we have not cracked the code on that. And we're not even attempting to get into the measurement of that. That is something that's been really looked at, or it's still emerging as a body of literature and has been looked at by others. And it's not quite a satisfying body of literature yet. There's still a lot of disagreement and competing definitions. So, but from what we've been able to discern, and kind of from our own research too, that knowing your true self, kind of becoming connected to your true self is really, in spite of how esoteric it can get in the literature, it's really a very straightforward process of investigating your most deeply held beliefs and truths. And what that means, just to break that down, is, looking at the areas where you already source meaning in your life, looking for new areas that, meaning is very manipulatable, looking for new areas that you can bring meaning into your life. It's about kind of getting clear about your small and large purposes, which is a very misunderstood area. And also getting clear on, what your most highly cherished values are and what you really stand for. And then most importantly, how those all work together to kind of create the essence of you, and your inner truth. So that's all that it is in a nutshell. I mean, it's very basic, but most people are looking at those components separately.
That's what, I mean, I think that's what was intriguing to me about it, is sort of how do we begin to really think about that, right, as a construct, a global construct, as opposed to just component parts, because I think that could help move the field, away from just a focus on diagnosing, right, and more of a focus on global concept. I don't know. I just it feels very hopeful to me. I realize we're not there yet, but it
Yes.
does feels hopeful.
And each of those territories, values, meaning, purpose, their true self, they're all vast bodies of research and literature. And what's our unique little contribution to it is that we're understanding that it's not useful to look at them in isolation. I mean, at first you need to understand them, but to be helpful to people, like when you need to look at them together, you can't be missing one or the other. So yeah, that part I'm really hopeful about as well.
Yeah, and I think there's something that is so important about, you mentioned this at the beginning, the importance of the training, but I do think that sometimes the research is being done by people who don't have the deep clinical experience and knowledge, and then sometimes the clinical work is being done by people who aren't bringing a research mindset. And I just feel very strongly that is so what we can contribute to the world through our amazing students and alums is a bringing together of those mindsets. So I think that's what appeals to me about this challenge. I see dissertations in the. So can you read another small excerpt from your book, that first paragraph on page 30 about, which I just love the way you describe sort of what we do to ourselves.
Oh, okay. When we're not following.
Yes, when we're not. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So often our inner guidance is telling us to make radical changes in our lives, changes that buck what we think we should do, changes that require radical acts of courage. It's terrifying to take a leap into the unknown. So we enslave ourselves with endless shoulds based on fear of uncertainty, guilt, or the desire to please others. Brick by brick, we imprison ourselves in incredibly complex lives, surrounded by unchallenged structures and obligations that have been handed down to us by our parents, our culture, or even our partners. Reconnecting and communing with these inner truths, however, is essential to reclaiming our lives from the shoulds that so often control them.
I mean, those shoulds are just, we all live with those shoulds, and that image of brick by brick, we've built them into this fortress. So I think, anyway, I tell me about that excerpt and where it came from and what it says to you about where we are.
It's really, I mean, it's the modern society living, that it's the tide that we're all swimming against, and the death by 1,000 self-betrayals. And it's what we are trying to inspire and invite people to really challenge and that mindset and look at the cost of it. And how it stacks up to, am I living the life that I really wanted to live? And if you want to live the life that you really wanted to live, it can't be driven by shoulds.
just going to ban it from my vocabulary. We have a great question. Great question has come in about how can, let's say in our own lives, we recognize the challenges in our family members who are living by the shoulds, who are feeling or evidence of disconnection. How can we, as sort of non-mental health professionals, just gently help our friends or family members who are disconnected? Do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, first let me say, and I want to honor the shoulds, because there are things that we should do and that we have to do. And it's really about degrees. Are we being ruled by that? And I think that the one thing I love about this subject is it's not that it's great cocktail conversation, but people do really enjoy talking about this stuff. And, it's what, when you're, it's good, it's rife for good, deep conversation among friends, family. It's those existential big questions. And, I think that those in some ways can be easier to have. These are kind of inspiring conversations and topics and ideas rather than making somebody wrong for their choices and how they're living their life.
Well, I think that's an important piece, right? That it's not a judgment. It's not a judgment model. It's a moving forward model.
It's curious, yeah, about, is there more?
We hope so. I wanted to ask you something that I've worried about myself, and you talk about in the book. Are we living a life of purpose? And I think that I love being part of this university, and I think education is a noble purpose. So I'm very honored to be able to be part of that. But I think it's hard for people to, we have this sort of myth about purpose, right? That it's noble, that it's, we're Mother Teresa or we don't have purpose, kind of is sort of how I'm thinking about it. Can we find purpose in our lives, without this kind of, and shed those myths a little bit?
That's a great question. Purpose is a big topic, but I feel like it's one of the most misunderstood concepts, and it just comes with so much baggage. I know I have so many friends and family that just feel a sense of angst that they're not living their big grand purpose. And when I talk to people about this, I'm just amazed at how binary people think about it, kind of like meaning,
Yes.
like it either exists, it's all, like I have this big grand amazing purpose and I'm saving the world, or I don't have a purpose, a really important purpose in my life. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Put simply, like purpose is really just a collection of meaningful goals that give you direction in your life. And the meaningful part is according to you, not anybody else. And so, your purpose can be to be, the best parent that you can be to your kids. Or an example I think I use in the book is that like a garbage collector who feels like he's really, cleaning his neighborhood and providing a service can have more purpose than like a high-powered attorney who views his job as a means to an end. So much of it is also subjective and manipulatable, like meaning, like how we interpret it. And, I like to think of purpose like a pyramid. I don't know if this is helpful, but it's really about the foundation is about, what are your various mini purposes in your life? Like, what's your parenting purpose? Your mission statement. What's your purpose, in your work or your partner purpose? And that's a wonderful way to kind of get some building blocks around the meaning, behind what you do already. And then at the top of the pyramid, I have a lot of exercises in the book about going beyond what you already do. At the top of the pyramid is really when you find yourself dedicated, to something that transcends the self. And, that's the most gratifying type of purpose that you can have. But I think that, the most important thing I try to remind people of as well is that purposes come and go. They're not stationary or enduring. Like, I think of them like a flower. Like, it's important to really try to notice what's emerging, what's budding, what's in full bloom and still really relevant to you, and what's also fading. Like, that can be the hardest to let go of, and take up precious energy. So there's purpose is, I think, easy in some ways, but that it's been made overcomplicated.
Yeah, no, I love thinking of it in these different purposes as opposed to my purpose. What is my purpose? Because I think that's where we get off track. Well, we're getting close toward the end here. I want to encourage anyone else with questions to send them in. But I don't want to leave without getting to the emotional. You have a lot of discussion in the book about connecting with our emotional selves. I love the concept you have of sort of pathways of feeling states that one leads to the other. And some of them, such as anger, can really mask other things, so we can't feel the pathway. So lots to think about in your conversation around emotion. But I did want to help get the audience some sense of your specific action steps and suggestions for connecting with your emotional self. So I'd love to, you have such great tips in there. Let's get some of those out for people to hear about. So, okay. So say what you want about our emotional selves, and then.
All right, I will try to be brief on this because I know we're running out of time.
It's a small topic. It's just a little topic.
But in a nutshell, emotions can be a huge area of disconnection for us. And you just cannot be truly connected to yourself if you're cut off from your feeling states. And often, understandably, emotions are really overwhelming and can be a confusing territory for a lot of people, for everybody, at certain points, and can mislead us and block us from insight. And it's often easier to just rely on denial, minimization, and avoidance as a result, but that keeps you cut off. So
I don't know what you're talking about.
Same. So, what I suggest here is nothing new. I'm really echoing some other experts and researchers, and really encouraging, inviting a new relationship with your emotional world. And the simple steps, without getting into some of the practices, are really about, being that neutral observer, just developing a different kind of relationship where you're a researcher again. You're a neutral observer, you're curious, and in that frame of mind, you bring a radical acceptance to, whatever it is that you're discovering. And the added piece is the self-compassion, like Kristen Neff. And that's a lifelong, practice and journey. But you can enter into that gently, lightly at any point, along this, similar to asking the question, am I feeling connected? Like, you can bring your curiosity to your emotions and your reactions and what gets you triggered. And with the information you get, you can begin to work with that and discover what helps, what hurts. And then I get into a lot of practices that are tried and true for many people that I know we don't have time for, but that's it in a nutshell.
No, I think it's so important, because I just feel like without that piece of it, we're gonna stay cut off, I think. So, well, I wanted to ask you. I want to switch gears just a little bit because I wanted to just have you talk a little bit about the health psychology part of your essence. How I think that that it's less well understood, I think, in the public in terms of what health psychology has brought to our field, which I think has been so important. How has it provided you a framework for the type of work that you've done? So I guess I have sort of two questions. So talk a little bit about the field of health psychology so that our audience can understand that a little bit more. And then I guess the second part is I can't help but asking you, as in my role, as we are dedicated to training the next generation of mental health professionals, as we were with you, how might you suggest we shake up our approach or our training to support the importance of connection in the work? So two big questions, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that.
Okay. The first one is the easiest for me. I love talking about health psychology. And I think that I happened into it so easily from my training at Palo Alto University. It was such a natural extension. I already mentioned that just having all of that solid clinical training, plus the assessment, plus the research, I felt like I was head and shoulders above my peers, at training placement, internships and practicums. And it was just easy to, get placements at Kaiser or the VA or, major training medical hospitals and kind of be immediately relevant and be able to contribute. Mm-hmm. So that I felt like I was teed up nicely for that. And truly, the reason that I think I went into it is because I was one of those students that never wanted to specialize. I felt like if I opened one door and dedicated, I was closing others, and I wanted to work with everybody. And health psychology, honestly, if you feel that way, it's a way to specialize without having to specialize, mm-hmm. because you get to see all walks of life, cultures, SES, just, and the commonality, of course, is that, there's often a health issue, but it's a wonderful diversity, that you get to work with. And I think what I love about one of my favorite things now is kind of the intersection of health psychology and positive psychology. I'm enjoying now calling myself a positive health psychologist.
Nice.
It's a specialty now at some colleges. And it's less about, how do we help somebody cope with an illness or a loss or a struggle. And it's more now about how do we help you, access your highest version of yourself and live your best life. And that is just universally applicable. So I really enjoy some of those bigger existential questions that come up, when people's worlds get rocked by something. But yeah, I can't recommend it enough as a specialty.
Well, and I think mental health professionals are so well positioned on that team, right? Dealing with the medical professionals I think, are not necessarily teed up to have those kind of conversations. So it feels to me like a wonderful place for that integrated team approach,
Mm-hmm. And to get to your other question, which is also a big question.
Yes, I'm taking notes. Go ahead.
Well, you and I talked about this a little bit already. So, I have given this some thought. And I just admire you so much for how you're always innovating and just really trying to further the program. It's so inspiring. So, when I think about training the next generation, or I think about my training and kind of what I wished I would have had, the thing that comes to mind the most for me is the importance of value-based living. Mm-hmm. It's not really anywhere. Maybe it is now, but it wasn't, in the curriculum then. And I feel like it's so important. And I see it as almost like a preventative care model, mm-hmm. where, rather than so often we're getting people, when things have gone wrong and way off the track. But values-based living is something I wish we were teaching kids about, and just helping, support people staying on their track before they get too off their track. I think it's that powerful. The
love that.
the other thing that I really love, and this comes in a lot of in the CBT class that I teach, but is these transdiagnostic concepts. I love getting away from diagnosis. I mean, it's useful and helpful where we need it and when we need it, but the truth is we're more alike than we're disalike, as human beings. And when you talk about things like meaning making as a transdiagnostic concept and something that is important and relevant to all humans, I just get goosebumps, at the universality. So, that would be another thing. I think we get really specific in our training, and we need to drill down.
Yeah.
But also these overarching,
Taking the time to step up and really think in an overarching way is, yeah.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of another overarching thing that I wish I had focused on more in my training. I felt like at the time theories were for other people to develop, and a lot of psychology theories, some of them, many of them are timeless, but a lot of them are really old. And at the time, I wouldn't have dared to think about developing a theory. And now that I'm working on that, I feel like, oh, everybody should be thinking that way. Like that's what we need, is this generation to really be stepping back, and not just little theories, but what I think is the most useful and the most lacking is meta theories. These overarching frameworks of how do all of these pieces fit together. There's so much zillions of separate fiefdoms, that we're all researching, and it is truly a necessary part of the process. But I just personally need, to see it from more of the 10,000 foot view and say, what are the biggest takeaways from everything that we know, and how do we, make that useful to people? And that just reminds me of something else that I would add, the usefulness, like that in order, a theory needs two things, mostly. It needs to be credible, to its peers and its community, but it also needs to be useful. And so much in our literature is hard to work with and complex and esoteric and not necessarily useful to the public. I just thought that was the way it was. But I think really encouraging students and trainees to look for the synthesis, the way to simplify and the way to make things useful. Personally, like I only want to think about one thing at a time if you're asking me to make a change. And, beyond that, it gets too complicated for me. And maybe that's too high of a bar to say, can we boil the entire field down to one thing? But that is what I'm trying to do, is to create a doorway, and I think that more students focusing on how to synthesize, there's just a freedom there to explore that I never thought. I thought, who am I to think like that about all these great theories and things that have come before me? But it reminds me of that saying that, if I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter.
Yes, right. Well, theories are galore in this amazing book. Thank you so much, Kristine, for joining us and talking about your book. I strongly recommend the book to our audience, and thanks to all of you who joined us. Remember that connection is a practice, so let's work together to bring more of it to this world. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Klussman. Thank you all so much.
Oh, I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you, Maureen.
Take care.